Imagine a factory, bustling with workers, producing goods day in and day out. The sounds of machines humming, the smell of industrial fumes filling the air, all part of the daily grind. For the workers, it was just another day at work. They had grown used to the smell of smoke and exhaust in the air, a normal part of their job. No one questioned it. The smoke was just part of the routine. But little did they know, that same smoke was hiding something far more dangerous, something that would soon bring tragedy. It was a factory like many others, a place where people worked hard, earned their pay, and went home at the end of the day. The smoke, though unpleasant, was dismissed as a necessary evil. After all, this was the nature of industrial work. The workers had seen it every day for years, and it had never caused any serious concern. But in the background, something sinister was taking shape. The factory's ceiling, once a reliable structure, had become a ticking time bomb. The truth behind the smoke was something that no one could have predicted. What seemed like just another part of the daily grind would soon become a deadly warning. The collapse that followed was not just an accident. It was the result of negligence, overlooked safety precautions, and a false sense of security. As the workers continued their daily tasks, unaware of the imminent danger, the ceiling above them was quietly deteriorating. The very foundation of the factory, which they trusted, was weakening. The smoke, once a minor inconvenience, had become the harbinger of doom. This story is one of those rare, catastrophic events that changes everything. It's about a factory that was once the heart of the community, providing jobs and stability. It's about the workers who thought they were safe, but were unaware of the danger hanging over their heads. And it's about the tragic collapse that would forever alter the lives of hundreds. If you want to keep learning about these tragedies, and the warning signs that are often ignored, leave a comment below and let us know what you think caused this disaster. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you want more stories like this. Now, let's dive deeper into the rest of this story. In the heart of the industrial sector, this factory was no different from many others that dotted the landscape. From the outside, it seemed like an ordinary building, its brick walls covered with layers of dirt and soot from years of relentless operation. Inside, however, it was a different world altogether. The machines were loud, the air thick with dust and chemicals, and the workers were often too busy to notice the small details that would later prove fatal. The factory, designed to mass-produce components for the growing industry, was a hub of constant activity. Workers moved swiftly along assembly lines, performing repetitive tasks with precision. They had learned to adapt to the environment, adjusting to the noise, the heat, and the ever-present fumes that filled the air. Smoke was simply part of the package. It was the price they paid for the job, or so they thought. But beyond the haze of industrial work, there were other, less visible dangers. The machinery, designed to operate efficiently, often belched out thick, acrid smoke. For years, the workers had complained about the air quality, but the complaints were brushed aside. The factory had been built in the early 20th century, and over time, it had grown outdated, with maintenance and safety measures neglected in favor of productivity. The conditions inside the factory were harsh, yet the workers persevered, driven by the need to provide for their families. The management, on the other hand, prioritized output over safety. They relied on outdated protocols, ignoring the increasingly apparent signs of wear and tear in the factory's infrastructure. Workers had grown used to the noise and the smoke. It had become a part of their daily routine, but beneath it all, something was slowly and quietly deteriorating. The factory's structure, particularly its ceiling, had begun to show signs of strain. The very building that housed the production lines and the workers was starting to give way under the pressure of years of neglect. The factory, once a symbol of pride for the community, had now become a ticking time bomb, a dangerous environment masked by routine. As we move forward, we'll explore the small warning signs that were ignored, the breakdown of safety measures, and the tragic consequences of a system that was willing to turn a blind eye to the risks. The workers, caught in the middle of it all, never imagined that their lives were about to be altered forever. In any factory, safety should be the #1 priority. But here, in this industrial nightmare, safety practices were an afterthought. Despite the ever-present dangers of heavy machinery, heat, and the toxic air, safety measures were woefully inadequate, and the workers were none the wiser. They had been working in these conditions for so long that the dangers had become part of the background noise. The smell of smoke, the constant hum of machinery. It all felt like just another day at work. The factory had long since surpassed its original design capacity. Machines were running overtime, producing goods at a rapid pace, pushing the limits of their functionality. But no one stopped to ask if the factory's infrastructure could keep up with the relentless demand. Safety checks were conducted, but they were often cursory, with corners cut to maintain the illusion of compliance. In reality, the factory was operating on borrowed time. The workers, many of whom had been with the factory for years, had grown accustomed to the conditions. They saw the smoke as a minor inconvenience, something they could endure as long as it didn't interfere with their work. They had been told by management that it was just part of the job, that it was to be expected in an industrial setting. But what they didn't know was that the smoke they had grown so used to was a signal of something far more dangerous. It was a sign of something slowly deteriorating within the factory, a warning that, if heeded, might have saved hundreds of lives. Despite occasional complaints from workers about the smoke and the air quality, nothing had been done to address these concerns. The management was more focused on production targets than on maintaining the factory's aging infrastructure. The cracks in the ceiling, which had begun to appear in certain parts of the building, were ignored. They were dismissed as insignificant by the factory's overseers, who believed that the structure was still sound enough to handle the daily wear and tear. For the workers, this was their livelihood, and they had no reason to question the practices they had been subjected to for years. They trusted that the factory was a safe environment. After all, it had been, operating for decades without incident. But little did they know, the very ceiling that sheltered them from the elements was about to turn against them. The signs of neglect were subtle but present. Machinery that emitted more smoke than it should, air ventilation systems that hadn't been updated in years, and the occasional warning from workers about cracks in the walls or ceiling. But these were all written off as minor issues, temporary setbacks in the grand scheme of things. The workers continued to push through, focused on their tasks and unaware that the building itself was starting to crumble beneath them. As the workers toiled away in their daily routines, there were small but telling signs that something was terribly wrong. These signs, though minor at first glance, were overlooked or dismissed by those who should have been paying attention. The workers, focused on their tasks, had no idea that the very foundation of the factory was under stress, and the management, blind to the subtle signals, failed to address them in time. The signs were all there, but no one had the foresight to connect the dots. One of the most telling signs was the increasing amount of smoke billowing from the factory's vents. It wasn't uncommon for industrial sites to have some level of smoke in the air, but this was different. The smoke was thicker, heavier, and more pungent than it had ever been before. It seemed to linger longer, filling the air with a sense of foreboding. Workers noticed the haze was more oppressive, but instead of investigating its source, they simply carried on, assuming it was just another part of the job. Then, there were the sounds. The constant hum of the machines, once a familiar comfort, began to sound strained. It was as if the factory itself was groaning under the pressure. The machines, many of which had been in use for years, started to show signs of where metal parts creaked and strained, and the rumble of the machines became less consistent. Yet, the workers kept pushing forward, hearing these signs as nothing more than the growing pains of a busy factory. Even the factory's ceiling, which had begun to show small cracks, was ignored. The workers had noticed these cracks, but thought little of them, attributing them to the normal settling of a building that had been in use for so many years. The management, too, brushed off the concerns. It was not uncommon for old buildings to show minor damage, and the factory had never experienced any major incidents in the past. The workers were reassured that nothing needed to be done, that the factory was still safe, but safety was a relative term. While the factory had been operational for years without major incidents, the negligence in addressing the deteriorating conditions was starting to show. The factory's structural integrity was compromised, but no one was willing to acknowledge the extent of the problem. The workers, having grown accustomed to the factory's imperfections, never questioned the lack of action. They believed that the factory had always been this way, and surely nothing would go wrong. Then, the unthinkable happened. Despite the growing tension and the clues that something was wrong, the workers were still unaware of the catastrophic event that was about to unfold. They continued their work, trusting that the building would hold up, trusting that the management would take care of them. It wasn't until the ceiling finally gave way that they realized the depth of the neglect and the price of their blind trust. The factory, which had stood as a symbol of productivity and reliability, suddenly became the epicenter of devastation. At first, there was a strange creak, almost imperceptible, like the sound of a heavy object shifting. The workers, absorbed in their tasks, hardly noticed it, but those who did were momentarily distracted, unsure of what they had heard. Within seconds, the sound grew louder, more distinct, and then, with a deafening roar, the ceiling above them gave way. The air was filled with a sudden, sharp crack, as if the very bones of the factory were snapping under immense pressure. The workers below, some with their heads still buried in their work, didn't have time to react. Dust and debris rained down from above, shrouding the factory floor in a thick cloud of smoke and particulate matter. Panic erupted almost instantly. The factory, once a place of routine, became a deadly trap. As the ceiling crumbled, large sections of debris fell onto the workers below. The impact was brutal, with large chunks of concrete, metal beams, and insulation crushing everything in their path. Screams filled the air, cutting through the dust and chaos. The workers who had once thought the smoke and noise were merely part of the job, now found themselves fighting for survival in a collapsing death trap. In the heart of the factory, the lights flickered and then went out completely, leaving the workers in a dark, disorienting void. The sound of machinery grinding to a halt was swallowed by the roaring crash of the ceiling collapsing further, as if the factory itself was collapsing in on itself. The workers stumbled in the dark, desperate to escape the debris and find shelter. But there was no safe place to run. The factory, which had been their livelihood, had now become their tomb. Amidst the confusion, those who were lucky enough to avoid the falling debris found themselves trapped by fallen machinery and collapsed structural supports. The factory, once an organized place of work, had become a maze of destruction, with workers lost in a maze of twisted metal and rubble. The confusion, coupled with the choking dust, made it nearly impossible to see, hear, or move freely. It was every person for themselves. And then, amidst the chaos, the cries for help began. Some workers were buried beneath the rubble, unable to free themselves. Others were still trying to navigate the maze of fallen materials, unaware of the extent of the disaster unfolding around them. The factory had been their world, and now it had become a deadly trap, with no clear way out. In the frantic moments that followed, the reality of the situation set in. The workers were on their own. The factory was no longer the safe, predictable place it had once been. It had become a war zone, a place where survival was uncertain, and where death seemed to be waiting for anyone who remained too long. Aftermath of the collapse left an indelible scar on everyone involved. As the dust settled, a grim silence took over the factory floor, punctuated only by the distant cries of the trapped workers. The initial shock had faded, replaced by the horrific reality of what had just occurred. Those who had survived the initial destruction found themselves facing a grim and uncertain future. The first priority was to assess the damage. Workers scrambled to help one another, pulling debris off their colleagues, but it was a race against time. Many of the injured were trapped under massive beams or crushed beneath chunks of concrete. Some were conscious, moaning in pain, but unable to move due to the weight of the wreckage. Others, however, were not so fortunate. The factory, once full of life, was now eerily quiet, except for the occasional cry of pain and the sounds of those struggling to breathe amidst the thick dust. Amid the chaos, a few of the workers managed to escape the wreckage, but the toll on those who remained was devastating. The collapse had caused irreparable physical and emotional damage to hundreds. Workers who had seen each other every day, shared jokes and stories, now found themselves in life-or-death situations, some not knowing if they would ever see their loved ones again. For many, the factory had been a place of routine, a place where they had poured years of their lives into, only for it to turn on them in an instant. Among the survivors, shock began to set in as the scale of the destruction became apparent. For those who were not trapped, the next step was to find a way out. But with the factory now a maze of rubble, escape was not a simple task. Panic set in as workers scrambled for the exits, only to find that many were blocked or too damaged to use. For others, the pain of seeing their colleagues trapped or severely injured was unbearable. Some stayed behind, desperately trying to save their friends, while others fled in sheer terror. The emotional impact on the survivors was overwhelming. As they fled the collapsing factory, they carried with them the haunting image of those left behind, some of them buried under the rubble, others too badly injured to move. The sight of their colleagues' bloodied faces, the sounds of their screams for help, and the weight of knowing they couldn't save everyone haunted the survivors. What had once been a place of work, camaraderie, and routine was now forever etched in their memories as a place of tragedy. In the days that followed, the psychological toll of the collapse became evident. Many of the survivors were left struggling with trauma. The experience of narrowly escaping death, of seeing their friends perish, and of enduring the fear and chaos in those crucial moments left deep emotional scars. Counseling and therapy became a vital part of the recovery process, but it could never erase the pain of that day. As rescue teams arrived and began the grim task of recovering the bodies of those who had perished, the survivors were left to grapple with their own personal losses and the horror of what had transpired. The factory, which had once been a symbol of industry and prosperity, was now a site of grief and mourning, with hundreds of families left to cope with the loss of their loved ones. As the dust began to settle and the cries of the trapped workers grew quieter, the first responders began to arrive at the scene of the disaster. The factory, once a thriving center of industry, was now a war zone of twisted metal, rubble, and debris. Rescue teams, along with local firefighters, police officers, and volunteers, rushed in, determined to save as many lives as possible. The immediate priority was to rescue those who were trapped beneath the wreckage. Time was of the essence. Every passing minute meant more lives lost. The workers who had escaped the initial collapse now found themselves standing by helplessly, watching as the first responders worked tirelessly to pull their colleagues from beneath the debris. Many of the survivors, though shaken, helped in any way they could, lifting rubble, calling for those who were still trapped, and directing the rescuers to areas where they had seen others fall. The sounds of heavy machinery and tools echoed through the factory as rescuers worked to lift beams and concrete slabs that had fallen across the workers. The situation was dire, with many victims suffering from broken bones, internal injuries, and, in some cases, worse. The rescue teams had to move carefully, aware that the factory structure was already weakened by the collapse, and there was a real danger of further sections giving way. Despite the best efforts of the rescue teams, many of the workers were already beyond help. The devastation was so severe that entire sections of the factory had collapsed into piles of rubble, and there was little hope of finding survivors in those areas. For the families of the workers, the waiting was the hardest part. As the hours dragged on, more bodies were recovered, but so many others remained buried beneath the wreckage. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the local community. The factory had been a cornerstone of the town's economy, providing jobs to hundreds of families. The workers were not just employees, they were neighbors, friends, and loved ones. As word of the collapse spread, the town came together in a show of support. Churches opened their doors for prayers, and local businesses began organizing fundraisers to support the victims and their families. But for many, no amount of help could bring back what had been lost. The families of the victims were left to mourn their loved ones, while the community faced the difficult task of coming to terms with the magnitude of the disaster. In the weeks that followed, memorials were held to honor the lives that were lost, and the names of the workers who perished were etched into the hearts of the town's residents. The rescue efforts, though heroic, had been too late for many. The factory had collapsed in a matter of minutes, and the damage was too great for the rescue teams to save everyone. But despite the tragedy, the community's response showed the resilience of the human spirit. The workers may have been lost, but they would never be forgotten. And as the town rebuilt itself, it did so with a deep sense of loss, but also a deep sense of unity. In the aftermath of the disaster, questions began to surface about how such a catastrophic event could have been allowed to happen. The collapse of the factory's ceiling, which claimed the lives of hundreds of workers, was not the result of a sudden, unforeseeable accident. Instead, it was the culmination of years of neglect, poor maintenance, and a disregard for basic safety protocols. The factory had been operating under increasingly unsafe conditions for some time, but these issues had been ignored or downplayed by the management. The aging structure of the factory had been compromised, with cracks in the ceiling and signs of wear in the supporting beams that had gone unnoticed or were dismissed as inconsequential. In fact, it wasn't until the ceiling gave way that the full extent of the building's deteriorating condition became clear. The workers had been working in a ticking time bomb, unaware of the danger that loomed above them. The factory's management had been warned about the state of the building, Some employees had reported the cracks in the ceiling and the increased amount of smoke in the air, yet no action had been taken to address these concerns. The response from management was one of denial, assuming that the factory was still structurally sound and that the complaints were nothing more than routine issues in an old industrial building. The lack of attention to these warnings was the fatal mistake that ultimately led to the collapse. But even when the cracks in the ceiling began to spread, there was no urgency to address the problem. The factory continued to operate, pushing the limits of its structure and equipment to meet production quotas. Safety protocols were minimal, and maintenance was often delayed or ignored in favor of maximizing output. The factory's leadership prioritized profits over people, and the workers paid the price. Moreover, there were no contingency plans in place for such an event. There was no emergency evacuation procedure, no structural reinforcements, and no plan to address the growing risks posed by the deteriorating building. The workers, unaware of the impending danger, had no reason to suspect that their lives were at risk. They had been taught to accept the harsh conditions of the factory as part of their job, and many had learned to work around the minor issues that arose over time. But the failure to act on those issues was what led to the catastrophe. This lack of action, coupled with the factory's outdated equipment and inadequate safety measures, was a recipe for disaster. The workers had trusted the factory to provide them with a safe place to work, but the reality was far different. Instead of a secure environment, they had been working in a hazardous, decaying building, unaware of the immense risks they were facing every day. And when the ceiling finally gave way, the result was tragic and inevitable. In the wake of the disaster, the community, the factory, and the families of the victims were left to grapple with the aftermath. The immediate consequence was, of course, the loss of life. Hundreds of workers perished in the collapse, leaving behind devastated families who were now forced to cope with not only the emotional trauma of their loss but also the financial burden of losing their breadwinners. But the repercussions of the collapse didn't end with the loss of life. The factory, once a pillar of the local economy, was now a symbol of negligence and disaster. The community that relied on the factory for employment found itself in an economic crisis. The loss of so many workers, along with the destruction of the factory itself, sent shockwaves through the local economy. Businesses that depended on the factory's operations saw a significant decline in demand, and many were forced to lay off employees or shut down altogether. The factory's management, which had ignored the warnings and allowed the conditions to worsen, faced public outrage. While some attempted to deflect blame, it became clear that the company's neglect of safety standards and its failure to maintain the building were central to the tragedy. Legal action was swift, with lawsuits filed by the families of the victims and the injured workers. The lawsuits not only sought compensation for the loss of life and the physical injuries sustained, but also aimed to hold the factory's management accountable for their disregard of safety regulations. However, the legal battles were long and complicated. While some families were able to secure compensation, others were left in limbo as the legal system dragged on. The factory's insurance policies were scrutinized, and many were found to be insufficient to cover the massive costs of the disaster. The company, already facing significant financial strain, was forced to close its doors permanently, laying off even more workers and leaving the community in a state of economic despair. The social impact of the disaster was equally devastating. The tragedy had torn apart families and left a deep scar on the entire town. The workers, who had spent years in the factory, were more than just employees. They were members of the community. The bonds they had formed through their shared experiences were shattered. As the town mourned the loss of its workers, there was a profound sense of collective grief. Many families were left without a source of income, and the mental health toll was immense. Therapy and counseling services became vital, but the damage was done. The sense of security and trust that had once existed in the factory was irreparably broken. The collapse also had a lasting impact on the way industrial safety was viewed. The tragedy sparked a national conversation about the need for stricter safety regulations in industrial workplaces. The factory's failure to meet basic safety standards became a case study in what could go wrong when profit was prioritized over people's well-being. In the years that followed, new regulations were introduced, and workplace safety became a key concern for industries nationwide. The hope was that this disaster would serve as a lesson, one that would prevent similar tragedies in the future. Yet, the families and the community could not simply erase the pain. The consequences of the collapse would be felt for years to come, not just in the form of legal and economic ramifications, but in the deep emotional scars left by the loss of so many lives. The collapse of the factory and the tragic loss of so many workers served as a grim turning point in the history of industrial safety. The shockwaves from the disaster reached far beyond the town's boundaries, prompting a re-evaluation of the safety standards that governed industrial environments. It became clear that a change in mindset was necessary, one that prioritized the safety and well-being of workers above the need for speed and productivity. For years, safety had been treated as a secondary concern, an afterthought in the pursuit of meeting deadlines and maximizing profits. The factory's collapse revealed how disastrous that attitude could be. It wasn't just about following regulations. It was about creating a work environment where workers felt secure and were given the tools and resources needed to protect themselves. This was the harsh lesson that the industry, and society as a whole, had to learn in the wake of the tragedy. In the aftermath, new safety protocols and regulations were introduced, ensuring that factory workers and industrial employees would no longer have to accept unsafe working conditions as a part of their jobs. The tragedy became a rallying point for advocates of worker safety, leading to stricter regulations on structural integrity, air quality, machinery maintenance, and employee safety training. The workers who died in the collapse did not die in vain. Their sacrifice spurred a movement that sought to prevent future accidents and save lives. The legacy of this event continues to impact the way industrial environments are managed. Today, every factory, construction site, and industrial workspace must meet rigorous safety standards, and any negligence or oversight is no longer tolerated. But while these changes have undoubtedly made workplaces safer, they also serve as a constant reminder of the human cost of inaction. For the families who lost loved ones in the collapse, the change in industrial safety was bittersweet. No amount of legislation or policy could bring back the people they had lost. The workers who had been at the heart of the factory's operations were more than just workers. They were family members, friends, and neighbors. The tragedy left a permanent mark on their loved ones, who would forever live with the memory of that day. As the years passed, the town slowly began to rebuild itself, but the emotional scars remained. For many, the memory of the collapse and the aftermath would never fade. But there was a sense of hope that the changes in industrial safety would prevent future tragedies from claiming more lives. The story of the factory's collapse serves as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the ongoing need to prioritize safety in all aspects of industrial life. The disaster is a part of the history that shaped the modern industrial landscape and is a testament to the resilience of a community that, despite losing so much, continued to push forward in the pursuit of a safer future. Thank you for staying with us throughout this tragic and eye-opening story. The collapse of the factory was a pivotal moment in industrial history, and it's crucial that we remember the lessons it taught us. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps us share these important narratives with a wider audience. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our channel for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think could have been done to prevent such a tragedy? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Every comment helps keep this conversation going. And if you haven't yet, make sure to watch the next video that's popping up on the screen. We've got more in-depth stories that you won't want to miss. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.